The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast for her 3 children. The familiar routine of school mornings had become her anchor during what had been the most challenging year of her life. Prince George was helping his younger siblings, Charlotte and Louis, gather their school bags when William appeared in the doorway, his face etched with the exhaustion that had become all too common. Recently, the past months had tested their family in ways they never imagined possible. Catherine's cancer diagnosis earlier that year had shaken not just the royal family, but millions around the world who had watched her grace and strength throughout her public life. The chemotherapy treatments had taken their toll, leaving her weaker than she cared to admit, though she fought to maintain normalcy for her children's sake. William had shouldered the burden of being both father and mother during Catherine's treatment, managing royal duties while ensuring the children felt secure and loved. Palace staff noticed how he had changed, becoming more protective, more present, and more determined to shield his family from unnecessary pressures. The weight of potentially losing his beloved wife had transformed him, making every ordinary moment feel precious. That Tuesday morning felt different somehow. Catherine noticed William checking his phone more frequently than usual, and there was an energy about him that she couldn't quite place. When she asked if everything was all right, he simply kissed her forehead and assured her that all was well, though his eyes held secrets she couldn't read. The children had been their saving grace throughout the ordeal. George, now 11, had matured beyond his years, often helping with his siblings and asking thoughtful questions about his mother's health that broke both parents' hearts with their innocence and concern. Charlotte, ever the spirited princess, had appointed herself as Catherine's personal cheerleader, bringing drawings and flowers from the garden to brighten her mother's spirits. Little Louis, still young enough to believe in magic, often whispered to his mother that he was sending all his superhero powers to make her better. As the family prepared to leave for the school run, William's private secretary appeared at the door with an unusual request. There was something at Kensington Palace that required Catherine's immediate attention, something that couldn't wait until later in the day. Catherine found this odd, as her schedule had been deliberately kept light to accommodate her recovery, and William seemed surprisingly insistent that she accompany him. The drive to Kensington Palace was filled with the children's chatter about their upcoming school projects and weekend plans, but Catherine noticed William's hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His jaw was set in the way it always was when he was keeping something important to himself. She had learned to read these signs over their years together, but today felt different from his usual royal protocol concerns. Upon arriving at the palace, William guided her not toward the usual offices or meeting rooms, but toward a section of the building that had been closed for renovations for months. Catherine questioned the route, but William simply smiled and said there was something special waiting that would explain everything. The corridors seemed unusually quiet, even for the early morning hours, and she noticed that several staff members they passed quickly averted their eyes, as if they were part of some carefully orchestrated plan. As they approached an ornate door, at the end of a long hallway, Catherine could hear faint sounds from within, though she couldn't make out what they were. William's hand found hers, and she noticed it was trembling slightly. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and for a moment she feared the worst. Had her health taken a turn she wasn't aware of? Was this some kind of intervention or difficult conversation she wasn't prepared for? William stopped before the door, his free hand resting on the handle. He turned to face his wife, the woman who had shown such incredible courage and grace in the face of her illness, and his voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. He told her that behind this door was something that would change everything, something that represented hope and love and the future they were all fighting for. Catherine's heart began to race, uncertainty and anticipation warring in her chest, as William slowly began to turn the handle, neither of them prepared for what lay beyond. As the door swung open, Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The room, which she had expected to find empty or filled with construction materials, was instead transformed into something magical. Soft golden light filled the space, and the walls were covered with hundreds of handwritten letters, drawings, and photographs. But it wasn't just the visual transformation that stopped her in her tracks. It was the presence of people she hadn't seen in months. Standing in the center of the room was her sister Pippa, tears streaming down her face as she held her arms open wide. Behind her were Catherine's parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, who had flown in secretly from their home to be part of this moment. Her brother James stood beside them, his usually jovial expression replaced by one of profound emotion. These were the people who had been her rock long before she became a princess, and seeing them all together in this unexpected place nearly brought her to her knees. But the surprises didn't end there. As her eyes adjusted to the warm lighting, she began to recognize faces from throughout her life. Her former roommates from St. Andrews University had traveled from across the globe to be there. Her childhood friends from Bucklebury, women who had known her as simply Kate Middleton, stood beaming with joy and wiping away tears. Even her old hockey teammates from school were present, still wearing the same mischievous grins that had gotten them all into trouble years ago. William's hand squeezed hers tighter as she took in the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a gathering. It was a celebration of her life, her recovery, and the future that had seemed so uncertain just months before. The walls told the story of her journey, from childhood photographs of family holidays to pictures from her university days, her courtship with William, their wedding day, and the births of their 3 children. Among the personal photographs were hundreds of letters from people around the world who had been touched by her courage during her battle with cancer. There were drawings from school children depicting her as a superhero, letters from other cancer survivors sharing their own stories of hope, and messages from military families thanking her for her continued support of their causes even during her illness. Pippa was the first to reach her, wrapping her in the kind of fierce hug that only a sister can give. Through tears, she whispered how proud she was of Catherine's strength and how the whole family had been planning this surprise for weeks, coordinating with William to ensure every detail would be perfect. Their parents joined the embrace, creating a family huddle that took Catherine back to simpler times, when their biggest worry was whether it would rain on a planned picnic. The room began to fill with quiet conversation and laughter as Catherine moved from person to person, each reunion bringing fresh tears and renewed joy. Her university friends regaled her with stories she had forgotten, reminding her of the young woman she had been before the weight of royal responsibility settled on her shoulders. They spoke of late-night study sessions, spontaneous trips to the countryside, and dreams they had shared about their futures. Dreams that seemed impossibly distant now but felt more achievable in this moment. William watched from the side, his own emotions barely contained as he witnessed his wife's transformation. The wan, tired woman who had been fighting for her health was replaced by the vibrant Catherine he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Her laughter, genuine and uninhibited, filled the room in a way it hadn't for months. This had been exactly what he had hoped for when he and the palace staff had begun planning this elaborate surprise weeks earlier. The children, who had been secretly brought to the palace by their protection officers, suddenly appeared at Catherine's side. They had been part of the planning too, though keeping such a significant secret had been nearly impossible for young Louis, who had almost spoiled the surprise several times with his excitement. George presented his mother with a handmade book he had created, filled with drawings and stories about all the reasons he was proud to be her son. Charlotte, ever the performer, had prepared a special dance routine that she insisted on demonstrating immediately, much to everyone's delight and amusement. Her dramatic flair and confident movements reminded Catherine so much of herself at that age, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude that her children would have these memories of joy rather than just the difficult months of worry and hospital visits. As Catherine looked around the room at all the faces that had shaped her life, she began to understand the true magnitude of what William had orchestrated. This wasn't just about celebrating her recovery. It was about reminding her of who she had always been beneath the titles and the protocol, and about the network of love that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her illness. The afternoon sun streamed through the palace windows as Catherine continued to move through the room, each conversation revealing another layer of William's carefully planned surprise. Near the far wall, she discovered a section dedicated entirely to her charitable work. featuring photographs and testimonials from organizations she had supported over the years. Representatives from several of these charities were present, sharing stories of how her involvement had changed lives and communities. Sarah, the director of a mental health charity Catherine had championed, approached with tears in her eyes. She spoke about how Catherine's openness regarding her own struggles during treatment had inspired countless others to seek help for their mental health challenges. The ripple effect of her vulnerability had created waves of positive change that extended far beyond what she had ever imagined possible. A group of military wives whose husbands Catherine had visited during their deployments had also made the journey to be part of this celebration. They shared stories of how her genuine care and understanding had provided comfort during some of their darkest hours. One woman, whose husband had been severely injured in service, spoke about how Catherine's personal phone call during her own chemotherapy treatment had given her family strength to persevere through their own medical crisis. William had thoughtfully included people from every chapter of Catherine's life, creating a living timeline of relationships and experiences. Her former art history professor from St. Andrews shared fond memories of her dedication to her studies and her natural eye for beauty and composition. He had brought along some of her university projects, carefully preserved over the years, showing her evolution as both a student and a young woman finding her place in the world. The surprise took an even more emotional turn when Catherine noticed a quiet corner where several elderly residents from a care home she regularly visited were seated comfortably in wheelchairs, their faces beaming with joy. These were people she had grown to love during her visits, individuals whose stories had touched her heart and reminded her of the importance of human connection across generations. Margaret, a 92-year-old former nurse who had become particularly close to Catherine, reached out with shaking hands to cup the princess's face. In her gentle voice, she whispered about how Catherine's visits had brought light to their daily lives and how they had all been praying for her recovery every single day. The simple sincerity of her words broke down any remaining emotional barriers Catherine might have had. As the afternoon progressed, William organized various activities that reflected different aspects of Catherine's interests and personality. A small area had been set up for the children to create art projects with their mother, surrounded by some of her former art teachers and current patronage representatives from arts organizations. George was particularly fascinated by a professional photographer who had been documenting royal events for decades, eager to learn about the technical aspects of capturing important moments. Charlotte gravitated toward a group of young ballet dancers from a company Catherine supported, immediately joining their impromptu performance and adding her own creative interpretations to their routine. Her natural grace and confidence reminded everyone present of her mother's poise, even at such a young age. Louis, true to his spirited nature, appointed himself as the official greeter, moving from person to person with questions and observations that kept everyone entertained. The walls of the room told stories through carefully curated displays that William and the staff had assembled over weeks of secret planning. There were letters from world leaders expressing their support during Catherine's illness, artwork from children around the Commonwealth, and photographs capturing moments of genuine joy and connection from royal engagements over the years. One particularly moving display featured a collection of items that had been sent to the palace during Catherine's treatment. Hand-knitted blankets from elderly supporters, pressed flowers from garden enthusiasts, homemade treats from families around Britain, and countless cards expressing love and well wishes. The sheer volume of support from strangers who felt personally connected to her journey was overwhelming and humbling. William had also arranged for several surprise video messages from people who couldn't attend in person but wanted to be part of the celebration. International leaders, celebrities who had worked with their charitable foundations, and even some surprise messages from members of other royal families appeared on screens throughout the room. Each message reinforced the global impact of Catherine's work and the inspiration her courage had provided to people facing their own challenges. As evening approached, the gathering took on a more intimate quality. Small groups formed naturally, with conversations flowing between childhood memories, shared experiences, and hopes for the future. Catherine found herself in deep discussion with cancer survivors who had reached out during her treatment, sharing strategies for recovery and discussing the emotional challenges that extended beyond the physical healing process. The transformation in Catherine throughout the day was remarkable. The tentative, careful movements that had characterized her demeanor since beginning treatment gave way to more natural gestures and expressions. Her laughter became more frequent and genuine, and the spark in her eyes that had dimmed during the darkest days of her illness began to return with full brightness. As the evening settled over Kensington Palace, William gathered everyone's attention for what he announced would be the final surprise of this extraordinary day. The room fell quiet with anticipation, and Catherine noticed her husband's hands, trembling slightly as he reached for an envelope that had been carefully placed on a nearby table. With his voice thick with emotion, William began to speak about the journey they had all witnessed Catherine navigate over the past year. He talked about her strength in facing the unknown, her grace under the most difficult circumstances, and the way she had continued to think of others even when her own world felt uncertain. The room was completely silent except for the occasional sniffle as people absorbed the weight of his words. He then revealed that this gathering was not just a celebration of her recovery, but also an announcement that would change their family's future in the most wonderful way possible. Catherine's medical team had been in communication with him for several weeks, and earlier that morning, they had received the news they had all been hoping and praying for. Catherine's latest scans and blood work had come back completely clear, with no signs of cancer anywhere in her body. The room erupted in cheers and applause, but William held up his hand to indicate he wasn't finished. He explained that her oncologist, Dr. Richardson, had not only declared her to be in complete remission, but had also cleared her for all activities she had been forced to put on hold during treatment. This meant she could return to her full royal duties, travel internationally again, and most importantly, be the hands-on mother she had always been without the constant worry about her energy levels or immune system. Catherine's knees nearly gave out as the full impact of William's words hit her. Complete remission. The phrase she had hardly dared to hope for was now her reality. The careful scheduling, the modified duties, the constant monitoring, all of it could now become part of the past rather than defining her future. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around the room at all the people who had supported her through the most challenging chapter of her life. But William still wasn't finished with his announcements. He revealed that he and Catherine's medical team had been working together on something special, something that would honor her experience while helping others who would face similar battles. They were establishing the Catherine Foundation, focused specifically on supporting families dealing with cancer diagnoses, providing resources not just for patients, but for their children and spouses who often struggled silently alongside their loved ones. The foundation would fund research into family-centered cancer care, create support networks for royal military families dealing with medical crises, and develop programs to help children understand and cope when a parent faces serious illness. Catherine's own experience navigating these challenges while trying to protect and support George, Charlotte, and Louis had shown her how few resources existed for families in similar situations. Pippa stepped forward at this moment, revealing that she had been working secretly with William and palace staff to organize the Foundation's first major fundraising initiative. The London Marathon, which Catherine had always wanted to run but had never been able to due to royal protocol concerns, had agreed to create a special royal charity category. Catherine would be able to participate in the next year's race, running, to raise funds and awareness for families facing cancer together. The surprise announcements continued as representatives from several of Catherine's patronages revealed collaborative projects they had been developing during her treatment. The Royal Foundation's early childhood development program was expanding internationally. The mental health initiatives she had championed were receiving increased government funding, and her environmental conservation work was being recognized. With a major new research partnership with leading universities, each announcement built upon the others, creating a picture of a future filled with purpose, health, and expanded opportunities to make a meaningful difference. Catherine realized that her experience with cancer, while devastating, had also opened doors to connect with people and causes in ways she never could have before. Her vulnerability had become a bridge to deeper understanding and more effective advocacy. The children, who had been watching their parents with wide eyes throughout these announcements, suddenly ran to their mother for a group hug. George whispered that he was proud of how brave she had been, Charlotte declared that she wanted to help with the new foundation, and Louis simply snuggled into her arms and said he was happy she wasn't sick anymore. As the formal announcements concluded, the gathering naturally evolved into a more relaxed celebration. Music began playing softly in the background, and people moved freely around the room, sharing food that had been prepared by the palace kitchens and continuing conversations that had been building throughout the day. Catherine found herself drawn to the window, looking out over the palace gardens where she had spent so many quiet moments during her treatment, processing her diagnosis and treatment options. The same view that had once seemed uncertain and frightening now appeared full of possibility and promise. William joined her there, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. Together they watched their children playing with cousins and family friends in a way that felt completely natural and carefree for the first time in months. The weight of worry that had settled over their family was finally beginning to lift, replaced by excitement about the adventures and opportunities that lay ahead. The following weeks after the surprise celebration brought a whirlwind of activity as Catherine began the process of gradually returning to her full royal duties. The first official engagement on her calendar was a visit to the Children's Hospital, where she had received her own treatment, but this time she would be there as a healthy advocate rather than a patient seeking care. The morning of the hospital visit, Catherine stood in front of her mirror, adjusting a bright yellow dress that she had specifically chosen to symbolize hope and sunshine. It was the first time in months that she had dressed for a public appearance without worrying about whether the outfit would hide the physical effects of treatment or accommodate medical equipment. The simple act of choosing clothes based on their message rather than their practicality felt like a small but significant victory. William watched from the doorway as she applied her makeup with steady hands, no longer needing to cover the pallor that had marked the difficult months of chemotherapy. Her hair, which had begun growing back fuller and shinier than before, caught the morning light as she moved. The transformation was remarkable, but more than her physical recovery, it was the return of her confidence and sense of purpose that filled him with gratitude. The drive to the hospital was filled with excited chatter from Charlotte and Louis, who had begged to accompany their parents on this special visit. George had opted to stay at school, but not before making his mother promise to take pictures with the children they would meet. The younger children understood that their mother had been sick and was now better, and they were eager to meet other children who were still fighting their own battles. Upon arriving at the hospital, Catherine was greeted by Dr. Richardson, her oncologist, along with the nursing staff who had become like family during her treatment. The reunion was emotional, with tears of joy replacing the worried expressions that had characterized their previous encounters. The medical team shared how her openness about her diagnosis had already begun making a difference for other patients, who drew strength from knowing that even a princess faced the same fears and uncertainties they experienced. The first stop on their hospital tour was the children's cancer ward, where Catherine had spent many hours during her own treatment, observing the incredible resilience of young patients and their families. Now, as a survivor and advocate, she was able to connect with these families from a unique perspective, sharing hope while acknowledging the very real challenges they faced. 8-year-old Emma, who was halfway through her treatment for leukemia, immediately gravitated toward Charlotte, who had brought along some of her favorite books to share. Catherine watched as her daughter, with natural ease and compassion, engaged Emma in conversation about princesses and adventures, providing a moment of normal childhood interaction that transcended the clinical hospital environment. In the adolescent ward, Catherine met teenage patients who were dealing with the social and emotional challenges of cancer treatment during some of their most formative years. These conversations were more complex, touching on issues of identity, future planning, and the difficulty of maintaining friendships when your life becomes dominated by medical appointments and treatment schedules. 16-year-old Marcus, who had been following Catherine's journey in the news, asked her directly about the hardest part of treatment. Catherine's answer was honest and thoughtful, acknowledging that while the physical symptoms were challenging, the emotional impact on her family and the uncertainty about the future had been the most difficult aspects to navigate. Her candor created an immediate connection that allowed for deeper, more meaningful conversation. The hospital visit extended into the afternoon as Catherine spent time with families in the waiting areas, informal spaces where some of the most difficult conversations and longest hours of worry occurred. She listened to parents share their fears, their small victories, and their strategies for maintaining hope during the most challenging periods of their children's treatment. One mother, whose daughter was undergoing treatment similar to what Catherine had experienced, broke down as she described feeling guilty for being scared when someone as strong as a princess had faced the same diagnosis. Catherine's response was immediate and heartfelt, emphasizing that fear was natural and necessary, and that strength came not from the absence of fear, but from moving forward despite it. The afternoon concluded with Catherine participating in a ceremonial opening of the hospital's new Family Resource Center, a space that had been designed to provide support, information, and comfortable gathering areas for families during treatment. The center had been partially funded by donations that poured in during Catherine's own treatment, money sent by well-wishers who wanted to honor her courage by helping other families facing similar challenges. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Catherine made a spontaneous decision that surprised even William. She asked if she could address the gathered medical staff, patients, and families in the hospital's main lobby. Without notes or preparation, she spoke from her heart about the transformation that her experience had brought to her understanding of courage, community, and the profound impact that healthcare workers make in people's lives. Her impromptu speech touched on the privilege she had discovered in vulnerability, the strength she had found in accepting help from others, and her commitment to using her platform to ensure that every family facing cancer would have access to the support and resources they needed. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with applause that seemed to echo through the hospital corridors long after she finished speaking. The drive home was quieter, with both children processing what they had witnessed and experienced. Charlotte asked thoughtful questions about why some children were sicker than others, while Louis wanted to know if they could visit the hospital again soon. Catherine realized that this experience had not only marked her return to public service, but had also provided her children with their first real understanding of their mother's work and its importance. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion. The scared woman who had received her diagnosis in this same hospital months earlier had been transformed into an advocate, a survivor, and a voice for families who needed someone to understand their journey. The circle was complete, but it was also just the beginning of a new chapter in her life and work. 6 months later, Catherine stood at the starting line of the London Marathon, surrounded by thousands of runners who had gathered to support various charitable causes. The cool April morning air filled her lungs as she looked around at the sea of faces, many wearing t-shirts bearing the logo of the newly established Catherine Foundation. The months of training had not only rebuilt her physical strength, but had also provided a powerful symbol of her complete recovery and return to full health. William, George, Charlotte, and Louis were positioned at several points along the marathon route, each holding handmade signs and wearing matching foundation t-shirts. The children had been involved in every aspect of the foundation's development, from choosing the logo design to helping pack care packages for newly diagnosed families. Their participation had transformed what could have been a difficult family experience into an opportunity for service and understanding. The starting gun fired, and Catherine began running alongside thousands of other participants, each with their own story and motivation for being there. Among her fellow runners were cancer survivors, family members running in honor of lost loved ones, medical professionals, and supporters who had been inspired by her journey. The diversity of backgrounds and experiences represented exactly what she had hoped the foundation would achieve, bringing people together around shared experiences of challenge and resilience. As she ran through the streets of London, Catherine was overwhelmed by the support from spectators lining the route. People who had followed her health journey called out encouragement, held up signs expressing their admiration for her courage, and shared their own stories of overcoming health challenges. Children held handmade posters depicting her as a superhero, while adults offered words of gratitude for her openness about her experience. At the halfway point, Catherine encountered a surprise that William had arranged without her knowledge. A group of patients and families from the Children's Hospital, where she had been treated, were waiting with a banner reading "Our Champion." Among them was Emma, the 8-year-old girl she had met during her hospital visit, who was now in remission and beaming with health and happiness. The encounter provided Catherine with renewed energy for the second half of the race, but it also reminded her of the ongoing responsibility she felt to the families who continued to face cancer diagnoses every day. The Foundation's work had expanded rapidly, providing support to hundreds of families and funding research projects that were already showing promising results in improving family-centered cancer care. As she entered the final miles of the marathon, Catherine reflected on the incredible transformation her life had undergone since that frightening day when she first heard her diagnosis. The experience that had initially seemed like it might end everything had instead opened doors to deeper connections, more meaningful work, and a profound understanding of what truly mattered in life. The finish line came into view, and Catherine could see her entire family waiting for her, along with representatives from the various charities and organizations that had supported her throughout her journey. Pippa was there with tears streaming down her face, her parents were beaming with pride, and William was holding Louis on his shoulders so he could see his mother cross the finish line. As Catherine crossed the finish line, the emotional weight of the moment overwhelmed her. This wasn't just the completion of a physical challenge, it was a symbolic victory over fear, uncertainty, and the limitations that her illness had temporarily placed on her life. The cheers from the crowd seemed to acknowledge not just her athletic achievement, but her journey back to health and purpose. The post-race celebration continued at Kensington Palace, where many of the people who had been part of her surprise celebration months earlier had gathered again. This time, instead of being surprised, Catherine was the one making announcements about the Foundation's future plans and the impact it had already achieved. The Foundation had secured funding for 3 new research projects focused on helping children understand and cope with parental illness. Support groups for spouses and partners of cancer patients were being established across the UK, and an international network of royal families was collaborating on similar initiatives in their own countries. Catherine announced that she would be taking on additional patronages related to family health and wellness, expanding her role beyond traditional royal duties to become a genuine advocate for systemic changes in how families navigate medical crises. The combination of her royal platform and personal experience had created unprecedented opportunities to influence policy and resource allocation. As the evening wound down, Catherine found herself once again at the palace window, looking out over the gardens where she had spent so many difficult hours contemplating an uncertain future. This time William joined her along with their 3 children, creating a family portrait of health, happiness, and hope. George, now 12 and increasingly aware of his mother's public role, asked thoughtful questions about how her experience would influence his own future responsibilities as a member of the royal family. Charlotte announced her intention to become a doctor so she could help other families the way Catherine's doctors had helped theirs. Louis, still young but perceptive, simply held his mother's hand and declared that she was the strongest person he knew. Looking back on the journey that had begun with fear and uncertainty, Catherine realized that her experience with cancer had not been something that happened to her family. It had been something that revealed who they really were and what they were capable of achieving together. The surprise that had awaited behind that palace door months earlier had not just been the gathering of loved ones, but the discovery of her own resilience and the infinite possibilities that emerged when vulnerability was transformed into purpose. The life-changing surprise had indeed been waiting behind that door, but it wasn't what any of them had expected. It was the realization that even the most frightening challenges could become the foundation for the most meaningful work, and that sometimes losing everything you thought you knew about your future was the first step toward discovering what you were truly meant to accomplish.